Which will make you faster? Having more power or being more aero? Well, we want both, of course. But as many of you have likely found, the more aero you go, often the less comfortable you can be and the less power you can produce. So what is optimal and what should you be focusing on? So to look into this, let's consider the science. As we increase our speed, the air resistance we encounter increases at a greater rate. Now, an easy to understand, but not fully accurate rule of thumb is at 10 kilometers an hour, we experience 2 units of drag. At 20 kilometers an hour, it's 4. And at 30 kilometers an hour, it's 16. Now we can reduce the effect of air resistance on us by reducing what is called our coefficient of aerodynamic drag, our CDA. Now CDA is determined and affected by the size, the shape, and the surface texture of the moving object. Now perhaps give some context and demonstrate this better. Take this example. I'm traveling at 40 kilometers an hour with a CDA of 0.25. I'll need maybe around 250 watts to do that speed. If I was to reduce my CDA to 0.22, in other words, improve my aerodynamic drag, I would now need just 220 watts. However, if I was to increase that to 50 kilometers an hour at 0.25, I require more like 400 watts, and at 0.22, around 350 watts. So the improvement in aerodynamics saves more watts at a higher speed. But what's interesting is that when holding the same power, an improvement in aerodynamics results in greater speed increase at lower speeds. Essentially, aero matters to all of us if we want to get faster, not just for the pros. So we can improve our aerodynamics by splashing out on fancy aero bikes, deep section wheels, and tech-heavy dimpled speed suits. Or we could just simply improve our position on the bike, potentially for free, and often actually with bigger savings. The problem though is if done incorrectly or taken too far, it can actually start to affect our power output. Now to take the example of slamming the front end to reduce your frontal area on the bike, as many people try to do, it results in actually closing up the hip angle, reducing that hip angle, meaning that it's essentially like doing deeper squats in the gym, which are really hard. And as a result of that, by going lower at the front end, you're also restricting your breathing, which then is obviously restricting the amount of oxygen you get into your working muscles. There is somewhat of a balance here though. I mean, if you take the extreme example, most people will produce more power bolt upright on a bike versus down in the aero bars. Ideally, we'd see as little drop off in power as possible, but it is perfectly normal to see some. Now, it essentially comes down to a watts per CDA equation without trying to complicate things too much. It's a bit like watts per kilogram, which you may have heard of before. If you were able to reduce your weight, but keeping your power the same or only a small drop off, you will improve your watts per kilogram. And the same is true for watts per CDA. You might see a slight power loss by improving your aero position, but that is hopefully offset by your reduced drag on the bike, therefore making you faster. But of course, all of this needs to be sustainable over a long period of time. With that in mind, let's talk about some key fitting considerations. And an apt place to start is with the saddle, not the aero bars, as many people do. We'll get onto them very shortly. Now, to get more comfortable in aero on a TT or triathlon bike, what you want to do is essentially rotate your pelvis forward on the saddle as much as comfortably possible. It sounds really horrible, I know, but actually trust me on this one, because it allows you to essentially get into a far more powerful position. It takes a lot of strain off your spine and opens those hips back out. Of course, you won't want to do this on any old saddle. The right saddle is key. You want to get yourself a specific TT or triathlon saddle, which will generally have a bit more cushioning and support towards the front of the saddle to accommodate this more forward position when you're using the aero bars. And ideally, you want to try a few of these saddles before if you can, because there are a whole host of saddles to choose from. Now, Ergon, our partner here on GTN, for example, has a range of saddles both for male and female for the different anatomies, but also for the different riding positions. So they've got these front saddles to accommodate those that ride more towards the front, and those also for the middle of the saddle. Basically, it has different densities of foam, different points of the saddle, and if it's right for you, you'll know. And if it's not, well, you'll also know. Well, now that you have hopefully sorted the saddle and you're not wincing every time that you go into the aero bars, the next place I'd like to discuss is the crank length. Now, you remember earlier I mentioned that When you go into the aero bars or even into a more aero position, you essentially end up reducing the hip angle. And ideally, to maintain our power output as best as possible, we want to minimize how much we reduce our hip angle. Now, if you picture this, the top of the pedal stroke, when the pedal is at its highest, the longer that crank length, the higher the knee goes, and therefore the smaller the hip angle. Now, if we can shorten that crank length a little bit, it is then also going to open up our hip. Now, with that shorter crank length at the bottom of the pedal stroke, to maintain the same leg length, we'd want to raise the saddle, further opening up the hip. So it's a win-win, which means that you don't necessarily need to reduce your crank length by loads. So if you're already on a 172.5 crank length, for example, you probably only want to go to a 170, and that would be plenty. And back to the aero bars. And for the most part, slamming or lowering the front end and even bringing your arms in a bit closer and tighter will reduce your frontal drag, but there can be consequences. Of course, lowering that front end, as I've covered already, will reduce that hip angle, but hopefully you now have the tools to minimize the impact of that. But probably the biggest consequence of all of this is it potentially being unsustainable. Sure, in your 5 or 10 kilometer test you did, it might be more aero, but is it still as aero 90 or 180 kilometers later when your back's really sore, your neck's really tight, you can't see where you're going, you're popping your head up all the time? Can you even run off it either? Well, as you can see, there is a lot to weigh up there. I would consider this somewhat of a journey, one that I went on for years myself as I refined and found my preferred and optimal position. But what about the power versus weight debate? Well, an improvement in aerodynamic drag has been proven to yield greater results by a slim margin than simply just trying to put out more power. As I mentioned earlier, at higher speeds, the wattage required to go faster does not increase just at a linear fashion. You have to put out higher and higher wattages to go faster. So it does make sense to put some serious effort into aerodynamics. But where is the tipping point? The only real way to find out is actually just with lots of cycling and lots of testing. Now, some suggest repeatedly performing FTP tests in each position and monitoring any drop-off. And I guess you could get creative and complement this by recording any power savings over a set course whilst holding the same speed. Unfortunately, there is no perfect test or equation. There are also many facts to consider that are very individual. A good bike fitter will obviously be able to help and advise you here. You should never make drastic changes yourself, particularly if you're a relative novice to these things. Wow, what a minefield. I hope it has been of some help to you. If you've got any questions, please drop them in the comment section down below. And if you've done any testing like this yourself before, and have some advice to share, also drop that in the comment section down below. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's video. If so, give it a thumbs up, give it a like. See you next time.